Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be back.
I know you're all here because you want to level up your understanding of risk culture, appetite, and tolerance, right?
Yeah, without feeling totally overwhelmed by all the jargon.
Exactly, like getting straight to the heart of it all.
A cheat sheet, basically.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And we've got some fresh material to work with, a chapter from Pritesh Biswas on risk culture.
Brand new, hot off the press as of yesterday, March 24th, 2025.
So think of this as your express lane to understanding the latest thinking on this.
Our mission for this deep dive is to go beyond just defining these terms.
We want to dig into the core concepts of risk, culture, appetite, and tolerance.
And to see how they all work together to influence an organization's success.
Absolutely, and we'll be pulling key insights straight from the source to make it crystal clear.
No fluff.
Let's start with the foundation, risk culture. Now, the source describes this as basically how people within an organization perceive, interpret, and handle risks.
It's not just about having a bunch of rules in a handbook, is it?
It's more about, like, the ingrained mindset, right?
Yeah, the shared beliefs and values around risk. The ERM, the Institute of Risk Management, defines it as the values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding of risk shared by a group with a common purpose.
So it's really about the collective attitude toward risk, not just one person's view.
Right. It's about how the whole group thinks and acts when it comes to risk. And what's interesting is that a strong risk culture can be self-sustaining.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when people act and behave in a way that supports good risk management.
It kind of creates a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. It reinforces that culture. But the opposite is also true, unfortunately. If you tolerate negative risk behaviors.
Like cutting corners or turning a blind eye to potential problems.
Yeah, that can spiral into a really destructive cycle.
That makes sense. So it's not something you can just implement and then forget about?
No, not at all.
You have to actively nurture it.
Absolutely.
The source outlines some key steps for doing this, like clearly communicating expectations, using things like policies, presentations, internal memos,
Making sure everyone is literally on the same page.
and not just telling people what to do, but helping them see how managing risk well actually benefits them personally.
Because that's a huge motivator, right? Seeing how it directly impacts you.
It's not just some abstract concept.
Right. It's about making it real and relevant to people's day-to-day work. Another crucial element is involving employees in identifying potential risks.
So it's not just a top-down approach.
No, it's about empowering people at all levels to contribute. And that does a couple of things. It fosters a sense of ownership and makes people more vigilant.
Because they're more invested in the process.
Exactly. And of course, you can't forget the basics, like providing proper training on good risk management practices and investing in things like IT security with transparent oversight.
The source even gives a practical example, the Kier Group launch.
They're a great example of a company that walks the walk.
They really emphasize a strong risk management culture through their performance excellence approach. And one thing that stood out to me was that all of their directors participate in visible leadership tours to really get a firsthand feel for the workplace culture.
So it's not just something they talk about in the boardroom.
It shows real commitment.
Absolutely, and that's what sets them apart.
So zooming out a bit, the source stresses that a strong risk culture isn't just some nice to have.
No, it's so much more than that.
It can literally make or break an organization.
It can be the difference between achieving goals, struggling to stay afloat, or even facing existential threats.
And this connects to the larger frameworks of enterprise risk management.
It does. The source specifically mentions the COSO ERM framework, which was updated in 2017. And what's important is that the update really put culture front and center.
So it's not just about processes and procedures anymore.
Right. It's about recognizing the human element. The updated definition of ERM even includes culture, capabilities, and practices as key components of managing risk and creating value.
It's really emphasizing that even the most sophisticated risk management systems need a solid cultural foundation.
You could have the best systems in place, but if people aren't bought in...
It won't matter.
Exactly. It's all about aligning the systems with the culture.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp of what risk culture is as a whole. But it's not just about the organization as this monolithic entity, right? Individuals play a huge role too.
Absolutely. While risk culture is a collective thing, it's made up of the attitudes and behaviors of all the individuals within the organization. And each person has their own personality and their own risk preferences, which then interact with the organizational culture.
So it's a two-way street.
Right. The individual influences the culture, and the culture influences the individual.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
The IRM actually developed a risk culture framework that puts personal risk preference right at the center.
It shows how it all connects. Personal risk preference, ethics, behaviors, and the broader organizational culture. It's this intricate web that shapes the overall risk attitudes within an organization.
And it makes sense that the ideal personality traits would differ depending on the context.
Oh, absolutely.
For example, you might want a CEO who's a natural risk taker for a startup.
Someone who's comfortable with uncertainty and making bold moves.
But in a heavily regulated industry like finance or healthcare,
You'd probably want someone more cautious and detail-oriented.
someone who's meticulous about compliance.
Exactly. And the source actually points out that traits like prudence and even a bit of skepticism can be super valuable in certain sectors, especially where safety and reliability are critical.
Like in aviation or nuclear energy.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not about labeling people as just risk takers or risk averse.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Right. It's about understanding that everyone has their own unique risk profile. And understanding someone's natural inclination towards risk can be super helpful in understanding how they perceive and react to different situations,
Absolutely. It influences their tolerance for risk.
how much they're comfortable with.
Right. It affects how they see the likelihood of different events, how severe they think the impact would be if those events happened. It shapes how proactive they are in preparing for potential problems and whether they can spot opportunities in those risky situations.
So it really impacts how people approach risk management overall.
It really does. It helps explain why different people react so differently to the same situation.
And that brings us to the whole idea of risk perceptions.
Which are fascinating.
The source talks about how risk has both objective and subjective dimensions.
And it's that subjective side influenced by individual viewpoints where things get really interesting.
Where things get messy, you mean?
Maybe a little messy, but definitely interesting. It's that subjective element shaped by psychology, culture, personal experience that can lead people to either downplay or exaggerate the true importance of a risk. And those perceptions can vary greatly from person to person.
So what might seem like a huge risk to one person,
Might seem totally insignificant to another.
and these perceptions aren't uniform across an organization either.
Not at all. You might have senior leaders who are less aware of the day-to-day operational risks that frontline staff deal with all the time. And frontline staff may not fully grasp the big strategic risks facing the company.
It's like everyone has a different piece of the puzzle.
And what's more, those perceptions aren't static. They change as people gain more experience and as circumstances evolve.
So it's a constantly moving target.
That's exactly it.
Now, these differing risk perceptions can cause some serious headaches for organizations. The source goes into quite a few potential issues. Can you walk us through some of those?
Of course. So, first off, differing perceptions can lead to inconsistencies in how risks are defined in the first place.
So you can't even agree on what a risk is.
Right, which makes it really tough to identify them consistently across the organization. Then there's the risk of individuals intentionally hiding risks or downplaying them for personal gain.
Like trying to make themselves look better.
Unfortunately, it happens. And even when people are acting in good faith, you can still have wildly different opinions on the likelihood of a risk happening, how bad the impact would be if it did happen, and what level of risk is even acceptable in the first place.
So much room for disagreement.
So much. And all of that can lead to bad data, which then leads to bad decisions.
And then there's the whole issue of unknown unknowns.
Yes. The risks we don't even know about yet, those can be the scariest.
Because you can't prepare for something you don't even know exists.
Exactly.
So it seems like differing risk perceptions can lead to inconsistent handling of risks.
It's a real challenge.
And there's a danger of putting all your effort into managing things that feel risky, but might not actually be the biggest threats.
That's a key point. We tend to focus on what we fear the most, even if it's not statistically the most likely or impactful thing to happen.
We're not always rational.
Not when it comes to risk. And ultimately, these perceptions shape each person's individual risk attitude.
Whether they see risk as a good thing, a bad thing, or something in between.
Yeah, do they see it as an opportunity, something to be neutral about, or a threat to avoid? And that fundamental attitude, then, has a ripple effect. It impacts how the entire risk management process works and influences the strategic choices an organization makes.
So individual perceptions, those subjective views of risk, they're really at the heart of it all.
They really are.
Now, the source then goes into risk biases. those mental shortcuts our brains use to simplify things.
Which can be helpful, but also lead to some errors in judgment.
Yeah, we're not always as logical as we think we are.
Not always. A bias, generally speaking, is any tendency to favor or disfavor something.
Based on our own experiences and assumptions.
Exactly. And a cognitive bias is specifically how our brains simplify information processing.
Like a mental shortcut.
It can be super efficient, but not always accurate.
Sometimes those shortcuts lead you astray.
That's right.
The source has some great examples from the Board of Innovation.
Like confirmation bias. That's where we tend to believe information that already aligns with what we think.
We ignore anything that contradicts our beliefs.
We might not ignore it entirely, but we don't give it as much weight. Then there's conformity bias, also known as groupthink.
Where you just go along with the crowd, even if you have doubts.
Right, you don't want to rock the boat.
And what about authority bias?
That's where we overvalue the opinions of people in positions of power.
Like your boss or a well-known expert.
Exactly. We assume they must be right because of their position.
Right, even if they might be wrong.
And then there's bandwagon bias, where we jump on an idea just because it's popular.
Like following a trend without really thinking about it.
Precisely. And then there's anchoring bias.
Which is?
That's where we get stuck on the first piece of information we hear, even if later information contradicts it. We anchor to that initial piece of data.
Like if you're negotiating a price, and the first number thrown out there sets the tone for the whole discussion.
Exactly. That's anchoring bias in action. Hilson and Murray-Webster refer to these as gut feelings or heuristics. Things like availability bias, where we overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall or that are emotionally charged.
So things that are vivid in our minds, whether or not they're actually that common.
Exactly. And it's not just individuals who have biases. Groups do too.
Like cultural conformity.
Where certain behaviors are accepted as the norm, even if they're not the best way to manage risk.
And then there's the tendency for groups to shift towards either a more cautious or more risky position than individuals might take on their own.
That's right. The group dynamic can amplify or suppress individual risk tendencies.
So it's not just a matter of individual psychology.
It's also about the social context.
So we've got these conscious situational factors influencing how we perceive risk, our often unconscious biases, and then the emotional side of things too.
The affective factors, as the source calls them. For example, if you're familiar with the situation, the risks might seem less scary. But if you're dealing with something new or unknown, your fear might amplify the sense of danger.
It all adds up to a pretty complex picture.
It does. And while we don't need to analyze every single bias in every decision, being aware of these tendencies can help us understand why individuals, and ultimately organizations, develop the specific risk attitudes and behaviors they do.
It's about being more aware of those mental shortcuts we all take.
So we can make more informed decisions.
Now, to try and understand this big abstract idea of risk culture, the source introduces a few different models.
Frameworks to help make sense of it all.
The first is the LIS model, which came about in the UK after some major rail accidents.
Right, a series of tragic events that really highlighted the importance of safety culture. The UK's Health and Safety Executive developed the model to help organizations improve their safety performance.
And ILA stands for
Leadership, involvement, learning, accountability, and communication.
And each of those points to a key aspect of a strong safety culture, right?
That's right. It means having leaders who actively champion safety, making sure there are open channels of communication both top-down and bottom-up, getting employees genuinely involved in safety matters, creating a learning environment where people learn from mistakes as well as successes, and establishing accountability systems that focus on fixing problems, not just blaming individuals.
And even though it originated in a very specific context, the source points out that the ILA model's principles can be applied to risk management more broadly.
The core ideas are transferable.
Then there's the ABC model, which is all about the interplay between risk attitude, risk behavior, and risk culture.
And it's really important to understand that these three components are distinct, even though they influence each other.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the source stresses that it's wrong to describe an organization as having a, say, risk-averse culture.
Because risk-averse describes an attitude, not the culture itself.
Exactly. It's about how people feel about risk, not the overall culture.
Okay, that makes sense.
Similarly, defining risk culture as simply how we do things around here regarding risk is misleading.
Because doing things refers to behaviors, not the culture.
Right. Risk behavior is what we can observe and measure, while risk attitude reflects the organization's overall perspective on risk. That's often characterized using the 4 Cs:
Which are?
comfort, cautious, concerned, and critical.
Ah, okay. So those attitudes then influence the behaviors.
Which then collectively shape the overall culture. It's like a chain reaction.
And finally, there's the double S model.
This one examines the social and task-oriented aspects of an organization.
Sociability and solidarity.
Exactly. High sociability means there's a strong sense of unity and shared purpose amongst individuals, while high solidarity focuses on collective goals and team performance.
And based on these 2 dimensions, the model identifies 4 cultural types.
Fragmented, networked, communal, and mercenary. It's important to remember that no single cultural type is inherently better than the others.
It depends on the organization's goals and the environment it operates in.
Right. It's all about context. But research does suggest that organizations that want to be really good at risk management should aim for both high sociability and high solidarity.
So having a healthy balance of the 2 is ideal.
A good mix of people-oriented and task-oriented elements.
So we've talked a lot about what risk culture is, but what does a successful risk culture actually look like? The source defines it as not just avoiding bad stuff, but having a deep understanding of risk and a positive mindset towards it.
It's about using that understanding to make sound decisions and encourage responsible behavior.
So it's about proactively identifying and managing risks.
Not just reacting after something goes wrong.
Exactly. The source outlines 10 key elements of a successful risk culture.
It starts with having clear and consistent communication from leadership at all levels.
So everyone's on the same page.
Right. Then there needs to be a strong commitment to ethical standards throughout the organization.
Not just paying lip service to ethics, but actually living it.
Exactly. Then there's the recognition that risk management is an ongoing process, not a one-time thing.
It's not a check-the-box exercise.
It's embedded in everything you do.
So what else is on the list?
Open and timely sharing of risk information. Promoting things like risk event reporting and whistleblowing.
Making sure people feel safe speaking up.
Absolutely.
That's so important.
And then ensuring that there's clarity around the risks that have been identified.
So no one's left in the dark about potential issues.
Right. Then there's recognizing and rewarding appropriate risk-taking, but also addressing unacceptable behaviors.
So it's about finding that balance.
A culture where people feel comfortable taking calculated risks, but understand the boundaries.
Right, because not all risk is bad.
Exactly. You need to be able to innovate and seize opportunities.
And what about the final points?
Valuing and nurturing expertise in risk management, supporting professional development and training, encouraging diverse viewpoints, and integrating culture management with employee engagement and HR strategies.
So it's really about making risk management part of the fabric of the organization.
And valuing those who have the skills and knowledge to do it well.
Now, how does an organization figure out what its existing risk culture actually is?
That's where measurement comes in. The source talks about a few different approaches.
Like surveys, right?
Surveys are a good way to get a broad snapshot of perceptions and attitudes towards risk. You can do them organization-wide or focus on specific teams or roles.
And they can be useful for benchmarking and tracking progress over time.
Right. You can see how things are changing. Another approach is interviews.
Especially with key people, like senior leaders.
Exactly. Interviews give you more in-depth insights into people's beliefs and assumptions about risk.
It's a more qualitative approach.
Right. Getting at the why behind the what.
And often the best way to understand something as complex as risk culture is to combine those methods.
Get both the quantitative data from surveys and the qualitative insights from interviews. The key is to tailor the questions to the specific organization and make sure everything is consistent.
So the survey questions are clear and concise.
And the interview questions are standardized.
And the UK's prudential regulator highlights the importance of drawing on a diverse range of data sources.
Don't just rely on one method.
Get a holistic view.
Exactly.
The source also presents a model called risk culture aspects.
This one breaks down the key elements of risk culture into 4 themes.
Tone from the top, governance, decisions, and competency. And each theme has 2 elements underneath it.
It's a nice way to organize the different aspects of risk culture. And what's interesting is how it links back to the double S model we talked about earlier.
How so?
Well, some elements in the risk culture aspects model, like how an organization deals with bad news and the emphasis on risk skills and competency, primarily influence the sociability dimension.
The people-oriented side of the culture.
Exactly. And other elements like leadership's approach to risk and the systems of accountability tend to drive the solidarity dimension.
The focus on shared goals and performance.
Right. It all ties together.
So let's say an organization has assessed its risk culture and found some areas that need work.
How do they actually go about changing it?
The source emphasizes that transforming a culture is a process, not an event.
It takes time and effort.
It mentions a firm, which estimates that building a compliant risk management framework can take 1 to 2 years.
And achieving a truly mature and embedded risk management process.
That can take 5 to 10 years.
It's a long game.
So no quick fixes.
No, it's about continuous improvement. The source suggests using the ABC model to guide the change process because it shows how positive shifts in risk attitude can lead to better behaviors, which then reinforce a more positive culture. It creates this virtuous cycle.
Okay, so what are the steps in this change process?
First, you need to assess the current culture, really understand where you're starting from.
Get a baseline.
Then, you need to define the desired culture, the end goal you're working towards.
Paint a picture of what good looks like.
Exactly. Once you've done that, you can identify specific areas that need improvement.
And come up with a plan to address those areas.
And then you need to actually implement the plan and track your progress along the way. Make adjustments as needed.
So it's an iterative process. You can have the best systems and processes in the world, but if the culture doesn't support them, they're not going to work.
Absolutely. So we've talked about what risk culture is and how to build a proactive one. Now, the source shifts gears a bit.
Okay.
It starts talking about risk appetite and tolerance, and it raises a really important question. You know, when we evaluate risk, we identify it, we analyze it, we rank it, but then
That's the key question. What do we actually do with that information?
Right. How do we decide whether we need to take action to mitigate a risk?
Or whether it's okay to just accept it.
Exactly. And to make those decisions consistently across the whole organization, we need a framework.
We need some guidelines.
Yeah. And that's where the concept of risk appetite comes in.
Okay, risk appetite, tell me more.
So the source defines risk appetite as the level of risk an organization is willing to accept or pursue.
To achieve its goals?
Yes, to achieve its goals. And it's not a simple answer, is it?
No. It's definitely not one size fits all.
What's an acceptable level of risk for one company might be totally unacceptable for another.
Right. It depends on a lot of factors.
It does. And the source outlines 4 core principles that underpin risk appetite.
4 core principles. Okay, let's hear them.
All right, so the first one is interconnectedness. Basically, what's considered acceptable in one part of the business might not be acceptable in another.
Because of potential knock-on effects.
Exactly. The second principle is measurability.
Measurability. So
Yeah.
you need to be able to quantify risk appetite somehow.
Yeah, you need to be able to measure it, even if it's just using a qualitative scale.
Right. It can't just be a vague feeling.
No, it has to be something you can track and assess. The third principle is variability.
Variability.
Yeah, the acceptable level of risk is going to be different depending on the type of risk you're looking at.
That makes sense. Some risks are inherently more tolerable than others.
Exactly. And the fourth principle is maturity.
Maturity. Yeah.
The maturity of an organization's ERM framework will influence how much risk it can handle.
Right. A more mature organization with robust risk management processes can probably take on more risk than a less mature one.
Exactly. And in recent years, there's been a real push to clearly define risk appetite.
Yeah, I've noticed that too.
And it's not just coming from inside organizations.
No, there's external pressure as well.
There is. The source specifically mentions the UK Financial Reporting Council's guidance.
Oh, right. Especially after the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly. That crisis really highlighted the dangers of not managing risk properly.
It was a wake-up call for a lot of organizations.
It was. And since then, there's been a much broader emphasis on the importance of having clear risk appetite statements.
Not just in the financial sector either.
No, it's spread to other areas as well. The source mentions guidance for UK charities.
Really?
Yeah, and even for the UK government itself.
Wow. So it's pretty widespread now.
It is. And it's even become a core part of the CO-ESO 2017 ERM framework.
Okay, so it's pretty much a standard practice now.
It is. And it's interesting because the source points out that risk appetite isn't just about avoiding threats.
It's also about seeking opportunities.
Exactly. It's about understanding which risks you're willing to take to achieve your goals.
To innovate, to grow, to enter new markets.
Exactly. And it's all tied to the organization's mission, its values, its overall strategic direction.
It's about aligning risk-taking with your core purpose.
Exactly. Now, the source also talks about risk tolerance.
Okay, risk tolerance. How is that different from risk appetite?
So risk appetite is that overall level of risk the organization is willing to take, right?
Right.
Risk tolerance is more about the specific boundaries of risk taking.
So it's like the limits within which you're comfortable operating?
Exactly. It's about setting those hard lines that you won't cross, even in pursuit of your objectives.
So if risk appetite is the big picture, risk tolerance is the more detailed, practical application of it.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's another concept the source introduces, risk capacity.
Risk capacity. Okay, this is getting a little complicated.
I know there are a lot of terms, but it's important to understand the nuances.
You're right.
So risk capacity is basically the absolute threshold.
The point of no return.
Yeah, kind of. It's the maximum level of risk an organization can handle without, potentially putting its entire operation at risk.
This is like your breaking point.
Yeah, you could say that. And historically, risk capacity was often linked to insurance.
Like how much coverage you have.
Yeah, thinking about deductibles and things like that.
Right.
But now it's a much broader concept.
It's not just about money anymore.
No, it's also about things like the resilience of your infrastructure.
Your IT systems, your physical facility.
Exactly. And your reputation, your brand strength, your competitiveness in the market.
Even the skills of your workforce.
Yes, all of that factors into your risk capacity.
So it's really about understanding the overall strength and resilience of the organization.
It is, yeah. And the source makes the point that risk capacity is both a boundary and a foundation.
A boundary and a foundation.
Yeah, it's a boundary in the sense that you don't want to cross it.
You don't want to exceed your capacity to handle risk.
Right. But it's also a foundation because it gives you a starting point for making decisions about calculated risk-taking.
Okay, that makes sense. You need to know your limits before you can decide how much risk you're willing to take on.
Exactly. So just to recap, we have risk appetite, which is the general level of risk you're comfortable with.
Right.
Then we have risk tolerance, which defines the specific boundaries within that overall appetite.
The upper and lower limits.
And finally, we have risk capacity, which is that absolute maximum level of risk you can withstand.
The point beyond which things could get really bad.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that risk tolerance usually sits between risk appetite and risk capacity.
It's that wiggle room.
Yes, it's that space where you might temporarily accept higher levels of risk.
But only while you're working to bring those risks back down to a more acceptable level.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the source mentions using visual aids to help understand these concepts.
Visual aids. Like what?
Like risk heat maps or zones.
Oh, right. Those can be helpful for visualizing the different levels of risk.
Yeah, they can help you see where your optimal risk position is.
The position that aligns with your risk appetite.
Exactly. And they can also help you see your tolerable risk position.
Which is the position that falls within your risk tolerance limits.
Right. And the key takeaway here is clarity.
Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Yeah, everyone in the organization needs to have a shared understanding of these concepts. That's what provides a framework for making consistent decisions about risk.
It's about creating a common language and a shared set of principles for managing risk.
Absolutely. So once you've got a handle on your risk appetite, tolerance, and capacity.
Then what? How do you formalize all of this?
Well, the source talks about creating risk appetite statements.
Risk appetite statements.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me more about those.
So these statements are basically formal documents that outline the organization's approach to risk.
Who's responsible for creating these statements?
The board of directors plays a key role here.
The board, okay.
Yeah, they're ultimately responsible for defining the nature and scope of the major risks the organization is willing to take on.
So they set the tone at the top.
They do, yeah. And the risk appetite statements are a way to document those decisions.
So they provide clear guidance to the rest of the organization.
They do. The source gives a good example of a farm machinery manufacturer.
What?
They're thinking about branching out into a new market, making dairy robots.
That's a pretty big leap.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And they have to weigh the potential rewards against the risks.
The technical challenges, the investment required, all of that.
Exactly. And then they need to see how that aligns with their overall risk appetite and capacity.
So it's a strategic decision-making tool.
It is. And to help with this process, the source lays out a 6-step process for crafting risk appetite statements.
6 steps. Okay, I'm all ears.
So first, you need to identify all the relevant stakeholders.
The people who will be affected by these decisions.
Exactly. Then you need to assess your current risk exposure.
Get a clear picture of where you stand.
Right. And then you need to set your preferred level of risk for different areas.
Okay, so this is where you start to get specific.
Yeah, you start to define those boundaries. And then you need to determine the acceptable ranges of variation around those preferred levels.
The wiggle room.
Exactly. And then the final steps are documenting and sharing the statement.
Making sure everyone knows what it says.
Exactly. And the source also points out that these statements can be organized in different ways.
Like how?
You could categorize them by risk type, by risk source, by impact, by objective, or even by organizational level.
So you can tailor them to different audiences and purposes.
Exactly. And there are 6 guiding principles for creating an effective risk appetite framework.
6 guiding principles. All right, shoot.
So first, you need to consider the complexity of the risks.
Don't oversimplify things.
Right. Second, the statements need to be measurable.
You need to be able to track and assess them.
Exactly. Third, you need to recognize that risk appetite is not static.
It can change over time.
It can. Fourth, the framework needs to be aligned with your overall risk maturity.
Your organization's capacity to manage risk.
Yes. Fifth, you need to adopt a multi-level perspective.
Look at risk from different angles.
And finally, you need to integrate the framework with your internal controls.
So it's all connected.
It is. And one thing I found really helpful was how the source broke down risk appetite by looking at risk capability.
Okay, risk capability. Remind me what that means.
So risk capability is essentially made up of 2 things. Your risk capacity.
The resources you have available.
And your risk maturity.
Your systems, your processes, your culture.
Exactly. And by analyzing both of those things, you get a more complete picture of your organization's ability to manage risk.
It's a more holistic view.
It is. And the source also gives a list of key requirements for effective risk appetite statements.
Okay, what are they?
Well, they should provide a clear structure.
Easy to understand.
Yes. They should drive thinking about potential outcomes.
Not just focus on the negative.
Right. They should describe the challenges and the reasons for the chosen risk levels.
Transparency is key.
It is. They should articulate acceptable and unacceptable behaviors.
Setting those boundaries.
They should use a relevant sliding scale for assessing risk.
So it's not just black and white.
And they should be dynamic documents.
Regularly reviewed and updated.
Exactly. And all of this really highlights how important it is to have senior leaders involved.
They need to be the ones making these decisions.
They do. They need to dedicate the time to think about the risks and provide clear guidance.
It can't just be delegated to a lower level.
No, it has to come from the top. And the source uses the example of a budget airline to show how you can translate a broad mission statement into a high-level risk appetite strategy.
So taking that big picture goal and turning it into concrete risk decisions.
Exactly. For example, the airline might decide to enter certain markets, target certain customers, and accept certain risks that align with that strategy.
And avoid others that don't.
Right. And then they can create more detailed narrative statements that get into the specifics of each risk category.
Okay, that makes sense. You start with the big picture and then zoom in.
Yeah. But the source also gives a warning here.
A warning about what?
About averaging risk scores.
Oh, right. That can be misleading.
It can. If you just take an average, you might miss some really big outliers.
Those high impact risks that could really hurt you.
Exactly. And that brings us to the concept of tangible risk appetite statements.
Tangible. Okay, so we're getting more concrete now.
We are, and the source uses that budget airline example again.
All right, let's hear it.
So they give examples of specific, measurable risk appetite statements.
Like what?
Like target seat fill rates on flights, acceptable fluctuations in fuel costs, thresholds for travel agent fees, all with clear numbers and acceptable deviations.
So it's not just vague statements.
Yeah.
It's concrete, actionable metrics.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes the link between these statements and the organization's risk register.
The risk register, right? That's where you track all your identified risks.
Yes. And they also talk about using key risk indicators, or KRIs.
TRIs, those are like early warning signals.
They are. They help you monitor whether you're approaching or exceeding your risk appetite or tolerance levels.
So you could take action before it's too late.
Exactly. And they also talk about the difference between internal and external statements.
You might not want to share everything with the public.
Right. The internal statements are usually more detailed and specific.
The nitty-gritty detail.
Yeah. They might outline specific levels of delegated authority.
Who can make what decisions about risk?
Exactly. And the source stresses the importance of reviewing these statements with staff and HR.
To make sure everyone understands their responsibilities and limits.
Exactly. Now, to put all of this into practice, you need risk appetite criteria.
Risk appetite criteria.
Yeah, these are the specific ways you define what's acceptable and what's not.
So how do you create those?
The source mentions several tools you can use, like ranges, risk rating scales, sliding scales, and KRIs.
Okay, so it's about setting those clear boundaries.
It is defining what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and what falls in between.
And you could apply those criteria to different things.
Yeah, to objectives, risk categories, or specific risks.
So it's a flexible system.
It is. And setting these risk appetite limits helps you translate those big strategic goals into actionable risk-taking guidelines.
And it helps you put controls in place.
Exactly. And it's a balancing act, right?
You don't want to be too risk averse,
No, because then you might miss opportunities.
but you also don't want to be reckless.
Right. You need to find that sweet
I mean,
spot.
that balance between caution and ambition.
Exactly. And the source mentions different types of limit systems,
Okay, like what?
like the three-leg system, which has upper limits, trigger points, and lower limits.
So you know when to take action.
And there's the four-leg system, which adds another lower limit.
Okay.
And then there's the UK government's five-leg system, which uses descriptive terms.
Descriptive terms.
Yeah, things like opposed, minimalist, cautious, mindful, enterprise.
So it's a more nuanced way of thinking about risk appetite.
It is, and those trigger points are really important.
They tell you when to escalate an issue.
Yeah, when a risk is approaching or exceeding your limits.
And the source gives examples in health and safety.
Right, where triggers are often built into operational processes.
So if something happens, there's a clear protocol for responding.
Exactly. And they talk about triggered action response plans, or TARPs, which are used in the mining industry.
Those are like predefined action plans for specific risks.
They are. And even in areas like health and safety, where you might ideally want zero risk.
You still need those practical triggers in place.
You do. You can't eliminate all risk entirely.
Right. You have to manage it as best you can.
Exactly. And the source makes a good point about not focusing trigger points solely on the red zone of a risk matrix.
Because you might miss some risks that are acceptable, even if they're high impact.
And you might miss those high-impact, low-probability risks.
The black swan events.
Yeah, those can really catch you off guard if you're not careful. So to sum it up, crafting those risk appetite statements can be tough.
It takes time and effort.
It does, but it's absolutely essential for good risk management.
It's the foundation of a strong risk culture.
And finally, the source talks about monitoring risk appetite and tolerance.
You can't just set it and forget it.
No, you have to keep an eye on things. Risk appetite can change over time.
Your business goals might change, the environment might change.
Exactly. And the source provides 5 tests for assessing the effectiveness of your risk appetite framework.
5 tests, okay. What are they?
So first, does the framework provide actionable guidance to managers?
Can they actually use it to make decisions?
Second, are executives aware of the cumulative and interconnected nature of risks?
Do they see the big picture?
Third, do the board and executive team understand the aggregated and linked risks?
How the pieces fit together?
Fourth, is there a recognition that risk appetite evolves?
Is not static.
And fifth, are risk decisions weighed against potential rewards?
Are you taking calculated risks?
Exactly. And the core idea here is to make sure that people understand the objectives and the boundaries.
They know what they're trying to achieve and where the lines are.
Right. And that all the major risks are identified.
Nothing falls through the cracks.
And that a risk-aware mindset is embedded in the culture.
It's not just a box-ticking exercise.
It's part of how everyone thinks and acts. And finally, the source points out that risk appetite operates at different levels.
Different levels of the organization.
Yeah, from the high-level strategic view down to the day-to-day operational decisions.
So it's a top-down and bottom-up approach.
It is, yeah. So, as you can see, building a strong risk culture isn't just about avoiding bad stuff.
It's about understanding and embracing the right kinds of risks.
The risks that will help you achieve your goals.
And it's about being clear about your risk appetite and tolerance.
Communicating those expectations and creating a culture where everyone is involved in managing risk.
Think about an organization you know. Maybe even your own workplace.
How would you describe their risk culture? Are expectations clear? Do people understand the organization's risk appetite?
And here's a thought-provoking question to leave you with.
Okay.
How could a seemingly small cultural issue within a team, something that might seem insignificant on its own,
Yeah.
actually end up having a huge impact on the organization's ability to achieve its big, ambitious goals?
That's a great question. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does. And it shows how neglecting risk culture can have unexpected ripple effects.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Absolutely. It's been a great discussion.
Until next time.
See you then.